Demi Smolik.
My name is Zach Smolik.
My name is Dylan Rivera.
My name is Roman Bruno Rivera.
We are representing the Chicago Ridge Library. We are interviewing Dave Mitchell on June 14, 2018 at the Chicago Ridge Public Library. This interview is being conducted as part of the Project Next Generation grant for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress and the Illinois Veteran History Project. Funding for the Project Next Generation grant was awarded by the Illinois State Library, a department of the Office of Secretary of State, using funds provided by the U.S. Institute of Museum and Library Services under the provisions of the Library Services and Technology Act, LSTA. Can you please provide your full name?
Dave Mitchell,
What is your date of birth?
November 16th, 1979.
Where were you born?
Right here in Blue Island, Illinois.
Who were your parents?
My mom is Patricia Schultz, and my dad is Scott Mitchell, who is he was deceased when I was very young, about 5 years old.
Were your parents in the military?
They were not in the military. I did have a grandfather on my dad's side who was in the Army, and then my mom's brother also served in the Army.
What were their occupations?
My mom is now retired. She was an executive assistant for a company for many years, so she is now enjoying her retirement since October of last year. And when my dad was alive, he owned a plumbing business.
What schools and colleges did you attend?
Well, I grew up the south suburbs here in Chicago, mostly in Tinley Park. So high school was Andrew High School. Once I left Andrew, I went to Moraine Valley for about a year before I joined the Marine Corps. And then while in the Marine Corps, I was a reservist. So I was going to Lewis University full-time. So I was there for a criminal justice degree. And once I completed my criminal justice degree in, I believe, 2004, I then transferred to Governor State a year later to complete my master's degree in social work.
Did you work before joining the service? If so, what job did you have?
I did. I joined the military when I was about 19 years old. My first job I held for a while. I was at Kmart in Tinley Park. That's where I had my first job at. I worked in toys. And then when I did that for a long time, and then once I went away to the Marine Corps at 19, when I got back from all of my mandatory training and stuff like that for 7 months, they didn't transfer me to the loss prevention section. So I did that for a while. So as a reservist, I did a lot of things because I was going to school full-time, working full-time, and being in the reserves, doing that once a month, 2 weeks out of the year in the summertime for my active duty time for training. So I was working a lot. And near the tail end of my service time, I already got hired as a full-time officer in Chicago Ridge in 2002. So I was working Chicago Ridge as a police officer, along with being in the reserves for about 2 years before my duty time was over.
What year did you start? Did you enter the service?
So I entered in 1998 is when I first joined into the military.
How old were you when you started?
I was 19.
Did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted.
How many years were you initially assigned for up to?
So any contract within the Marine Corps for military service that I'm understanding was 8 years, and it's how you do that 8 years. So I did 6 years in the reserves, which was mandatory, and then I did 2 years in the inactive ready reserve once I was finished.
How long did you actually serve?
6 years.
Why did? What branch of service did you serve with?
I joined the United States Marine Corps.
Why did you choose that specific branch? Did you have a reason for joining that particular branch?
I did. You know, I looked into all the branches, and it was the one I felt was the most respected. It was one I felt was going to challenge me the most. It had the longest boot camp. They're out of all the military branches. So after visiting all the recruiters for every single one, I chose the Marine Corps because I wanted the challenge.
What was the highest rank you held?
So when I left in 2004 from my active reserve time, I left as a sergeant.
How did it feel when you started your service experience? Was it scary?
Yeah, it was scary. You know, I know my mom wasn't too happy with my decision. You know, but it was definitely scary. It was the first time I left home on my own. You know, 19, you lived at home for a long time. You know, it was when I had to, pretty much learn how to take care of myself type thing. So yeah, it was scary. You know, I think she was more scared than I was.
How did you adapt to the military?
You know, the military life is pretty structured. So I mean, at times it's hard, but I mean, it's also easy because your day is planned out for you. What you're doing when you got to wake up. It was surely an experience. Leaving the airport O'Hare, flying into San Diego where I went to boot camp. And then you knew it changed from there. It was, that first night that you get there, you get off the bus. I mean, first you leave the airport, you get on a bus, and then they make you put your heads down. Because they didn't want you to know where you were going. It didn't end up being right next to the airport, but they drove around for a while, thinking you're, heading on a long trip. So it was scary, and as soon as the drill instructor gets on the bus, yelling and screaming, get off my bus, it changed. And then you get off the bus, and then you have a row of yellow footprints, and those footprints are famous. Whether every Marine that joins sets foot on those footsteps, and so that's definitely something that I will never forget. And that night, you're putting in a hold platoon for a few days until you get with your regular platoon, and that's where you get your head shaved for the first time that night. You're signing in, administrative forms, stuff like that. So you don't know what you're in for. Anything that you went there with was taken away from you, except for your glasses for the time being until you got issued new ones. So yeah, it was scary. Sometimes you thought of what I get myself into.
Where did you attend basic training? Where were you stationed?
So there's two different boot camps for the Marine Corps. There's one on the East Coast in Parris Island, and then I went to Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego, which is right next to the San Diego airport.
How long did you have to train per day?
Well, while we were in the barracks, so they called it garrison, and you were required to get a certain number of hours of sleep. But I mean, you trained all day until you went to sleep about 10 o'clock at night and then got up early in the morning. So, it was long days, for sure.
What was basic training
like? It was one of the most memorable experiences you can probably have. I mean, I was there for 3 months, about 13 weeks. And from the moment you get off the bus, I mean, it's about them molding you into becoming a Marine, just like everybody else who's gone before you. They break you down and they build you up, and it's an experience that you can never forget.
What were the living conditions like?
So when we were in the barracks, we lived in what was called squad bays when we were in our assigned platoons, and it's just it's just a big rectangular long room with bunk beds just, throughout the bunk beds, but the bunk beds are just throughout the barracks, lined on either side of the hallway. And then we also had, they call it the Drill Instructor Hut, where each night one of the drill instructors was required to stay there with us, so we just weren't there by ourselves. Then you had, your showers and your bathrooms and stuff like that. So it was, but it was just a big open room. There was no privacy.
Could you call and talk to your family during basic training?
So the only time I got to call my mom was the day that I arrived. So you get there, you sign your paperwork, you get your hair cut, you're allowed to make one phone call, and thankfully my mom answered. And you have they give you what you need to read. You arrived, you're safe, you're healthy, and and then you pretty much have to end the conversation. So it's really quick. It's nothing extensive, but other than that, you're allowed to write home. I was allowed to write home, so I did that, and I was able to receive mail. So if somebody wanted to write me, a friend or a relative or whoever wanted to write, they could, and I could write them back. But that was the only form of communication we had with the outside. There was no TV, no cable, well, at the time, nobody really had cell phones when I was in, but you weren't allowed that, but just to write.
What was the food like?
The food, I could barely remember the food. We weren't given a lot of time to eat, We were restrictive. After hearing some of what the other experiences some of my other friends have had in other branches of the services, we were restrictive on what we could eat. There's no ice cream or anything like that. So it was high calorie meals, and you had to eat them quick. You sit down, you go through the line, you get your food that they were going to give you, and you sit down, and as soon as either your drill instructor was finished eating, or they called the leader of our platoon a guide. They picked one person to be the guide, and when they were finished, you were finished. So sometimes you didn't get to enjoy the food so much.
Were you able to have a social life? What types of things did you do for fun?
Well, in boot camp, there is no social life. Monday through Friday was your work week if you were in the barracks and not in the field. And Saturdays, you cleaned. You had to clean the squad bays and stuff like that. We had, required to mop the floors, buff the floors, clean the toilets, the shower area, stuff like that. Every day, we had to make sure our beds were made a certain way, and if they were not, they were ripped up and made to do again, just so they were perfect. And it's just to instill in us one of the building things of attention to detail. And the Sundays was kind of like an off day, but we really didn't go out and really do anything.
Where were you stationed after basic training?
So after basic, I came home for a couple weeks, and then I had to go to about 14 to 17 days of infantry training because although my job was in combat arms, I was not infantry, so you have to go. So after basic training, I left for 2 weeks, came back, and had to go to Camp Pendleton for 2 weeks or so for infantry training. And then once I left Camp Pendleton after those 17 days, I was then shipped off to Oklahoma, where I was at for about 3 to 4 months. And that's where I did my job training. They call it MOS. Military Occupational Specialty, and I was a 0861, which is a Field Artillery Scout Observer. So actually, the Marine Corps doesn't have a whole lot of training bases, so I was actually on an Army base, and that's where I was learning my job skills. And then once I finished in Fort Sill, I then went back out to San Diego, to Coronado, for another 2 weeks of Naval Gunfire School. And then I went home. I got then separated from active duty after a total of about 7 months, and then my duty station was in Joliet.
Were your living conditions different than basic training?
Very similar. Most of the time you were in a squad bay. They treated you a little bit different when you were in your job school. you're a little bit more self-sufficient, but we still kind of had the same squad bays, the same cleaning duties. So it was fairly same while I was on active duty.
Was the food different at your new base?
Some of the best food I had was on the naval base in Coronado. They can cook.
Do you have any basic training stories that you would like to share?
Yeah, when it started a few years before me, but one of the graduating requirements for basic training was called the Crucible. It's 2.5 to 3 days of sleep deprivation, food deprivation. You're working in teams, so you have a bunch of critical tasks you have to do in learning how to work in small teams and to complete those things. Going over barriers, crossing, water barriers and stuff like that. And you go on long marches, and then one of the final things you have to do is you go on a road march, and you have to climb up on this hill. And at the end of it, once you've completed the whole 2.5, 3 days, that's where you get your Eagle Globe and Anchor. So that's the Marine symbol, and it's handed to you. So yeah, that was probably the most memorable moments, obviously, you can have, because you've earned it. And then after that, they give you what's called the Warrior's Breakfast. Because your stomach shrank for over 2.5 days. They give you anything you can think of, pancakes and French toast, you name it, they made it for us. Although, when you have to realize that when you go in the field for that long and have that food and sleep deprivation, when you start having real food again, it doesn't go well with some people because their stomachs are so small. So, but yeah, that's obviously one of the moments where when you get that Eagle Globe and Anchor and you made it. And it's that sense of accomplishment that you become a Marine at that moment.
When you finished basic training, what position did you hold?
So at the end of basic, I finished as a private first class because I did have some education in my background. So instead of starting out as a private, I was a private first class, and then I still have not attained my job school yet. So although I was going to be a forward observer, I have yet to complete that at the end of basic training.
Did you receive any specialized training for that position? Did you feel that you received enough training?
Yeah, so for my job, I spent a lot of time in Fort Sill. So as a field artillery scout observer, my job was pretty much to be on the front lines. I was always attached to, if I were to be deployed, I'd be attached to the infantry or tanks or something else like that, where I could direct in artillery fire. I could also direct in mortars. It was also part of it, and then I could call in any air fire. So any helicopters or airplanes that were going to bring in bombs or ordnance, I would direct them in to where the target was. I also got a chance to, part of my naval gunfire school was to direct fire of destroyers and cruisers that were out at sea. So we actually got to call in some of the naval ships fire to the land. So that was pretty neat.
Do you feel that you received enough training?
I do. It's always continuing. It's basic training. You're always gonna learn new things. So I learned, land navigation, the map, binoculars, and a compass was my best friend. So yeah, I believe I got enough training to complete my tasks once I got to my unit. And then once I got to my unit in Joliet, I obviously had a staff sergeant and a mentor who was in charge of me.
What were some of the roles of the military?
There was a lot of roles, very structured. Obviously there was a rank structure first and foremost. So obviously there was a chain of command. You got to follow chain of command. You had certain liberties where you had to be on base at a certain time or be back in your barracks at a certain time. So you had to follow rules and the orders, or there obviously was consequences for that. So lots of rules.
Did you serve in any wars?
I did not.
feel while you were serving?
While I served, I felt great. I enjoyed being a Marine. I love serving my country. It was something that you'll never forget. It was something that if I was 18 or 19, I would do all over again. So you feel that great sense of pride while you serve. And obviously one of the biggest moments, while I was serving was when 9/11 happened. I was still in the reserves at that time, and you got the calls to turn on the TV, and the phone calls following that with military units nationwide going on standby because you didn't know what was going to happen. So it was obviously scary and at times, but it was I highly enjoyed being in the military, and it was, you get a sense of pride for not only your country but for the service that you're serving.
And would you be able to explain exactly what the reserves are, like what you do and stuff?
So the reserves are just another component of any branch of the military where we are required to, so active duty, you're required to serve 4 years of active duty. If you're in the reserves, you got to do 6. And what our responsibilities are is once you get into boot camp, you finish all of your training, you are then detached to your reserve unit. So that allowed me to go back to school, work full-time, do that, and go back to school full-time. And so my requirements were to do 1 weekend a month. Usually it was Friday, Saturday, Sunday of each month. And our unit, the majority of the time, went up to Fort McCoy in Wisconsin. And what we did up there is we went in the field and I performed my job. The howitzers, the big cannons, they put them on the gun line. I went up on top of a hill and we directed fire to targets that were out in the firing range, so we could practice and we could practice our skill set and make sure that should anything happen, that we're up on our skills. So that was 1 weekend a month, and then also we were required to do 2 weeks in the summer. So I would go different places for the summer. I've been in different bases, Army bases, Camp Ripley in Minnesota. I went to Indiana for 2 weeks. I was down in 29 Palms, California a few times for what they call combined arms exercises. That's where you are actually taking entire Marine units, whether it's tanks, the aircraft, infantry, and that's where you're coming all together and pretty much doing military exercises with multiple different units. So that's 2 weeks out of the year, and then sometimes I would have to go to specialty training if required to, for my job. If they needed me to go to a 1 week here or there, I had to go to Oakland for some training with some other units with my battalion. So that's what that consisted of. With the reserves for the Marines, is we had a lot of responsibility, for military funeral details. We were tasked with, whether you're a former or active in the military, and if a Marine came home, and we did those services for them. We also did people who formerly served in the Marines. We also did their funeral details. And then part of the big program for the reserves is the Toys for Tots program. That's big for the Marine Reserves. And so I did that for a while. We wear our dress blue uniforms and go out and collect toys, and we did that every November, December. So in fact, while I was working at the police department, still in the reserves, I was actually coming to the, I want to say it was the American Legion. They were having a night when I actually got to go there and pick up some toys from there in my uniform.
Do you have any stories you would like to share?
I had, there's a few stories. There's one, some of the best times I had was being in the military, and I got to see a lot of different things. with my job. I was never in the same place where I was always doing, a task being with different things. And one of the best times that I've seen or had been a part of was actually being in a helicopter and performing my job. That was kind of neat. Being able to call for fire from a helicopter, was kind of pretty an awesome experience. So that was probably one of the things I won't forget.
How did you readjust to civilian life after serving?
Well, I was already part of civilian life. I was kind of doing both at the same time, so it wasn't really a huge adjustment. But I will say that the camaraderie that you make with the people that you serve, in a roundabout way, you kind of seek that out too. These people that you serve with, the men and women that you serve with, at the drop of a hat would do anything for you. They were your brothers and sisters, even though they weren't by blood. Just you all went through the same thing. You went to the same boot camp. You had the same experiences. Maybe you had different jobs, but it was the same structure, the same experience, the same self of esprit de corps, your pride in yourself and in your country and the service that you were servicing. So I definitely, you keep up with, you can relate to people who have served the country. It doesn't matter what branch it is, but you've all been through the same type of thing.
Did you return to the job you left? When were you discharged?
So I left the Marine Corps Reserves in 2004, and in 2002, I got hired full-time with Chicago Ridge Police Department. So I was already full-time with Chicago Ridge, and so when I was discharged, I was still working the same job that I was for the last 2 years of my career in the military.
Did any of your siblings serve in the military?
Yeah, my grandfather on my dad's side, he served in the Army, and then also my mom's brother, he served in the Army as well.
What branch did they serve?
Both were in the Army.
Did he or can you recall your instructors?
I do. We have a few different drill instructors when I was in boot camp. You had your senior drill instructor, which was like the father figure. He's the one who taught you core values and stuff like that. He was not the one to really yell at you. He was also our drill. He was the drill instructor in charge of teaching us drill, and he was the one calling out cadence. We had, initial drill and final drill where we would do drill movements, not only with and without the rifle. He would be the one doing that and teaching us core values, and his name was Staff Sergeant Patterson. He was my drill instructor, senior drill instructor. And the only other drill instructor I kind of remember is Sergeant Brown. Staff Sergeant Brown, I'm sorry, and he was one of the other ones. But he was, Staff Sergeant Brown and the one or two other regular drill instructors you had. You're the ones who, ran your PT. They're the ones, who gave you drill day in and day out. They're the ones in your face screaming and hollering, stuff like that. So yeah.
What did your uniforms look like, and were they comfortable?
Several different uniforms. Obviously, you have your camouflage uniforms. Those are the most comfortable. So you had your boots, you had your camouflage uniforms. When I got into boot camp, I was issued just the woodland pattern. Then once I got to my unit in Joliet, they transferred into the digital pattern, and we got the woodland digital and then the desert digital camouflage ones. And then you had your other uniforms, your more dress uniforms. You had the basic uniform was green pants with a tan shirt, whether it's short sleeve or long sleeve. And then you also had a green jacket, kind of like a dress coat that went with that. And then I brought today, if we get to it, my dress blues. And that was the uniform I did. That's for the Marine Corps ball you wore that for. And he was, if you went to a wedding, you were wearing your dress blues. Toys for tots, picking up toys, wearing dress blues. That's the uniform that you wear for more of those occasions. And those aren't made for comfort, the dress uniforms.
So what gear were you provided for different weather conditions?
So we were issued sleeping bags, and it was it was a sleeping system. So, we had the innermost layer was, for extremely cold conditions. You had the medium layer for, not like, extremely cold conditions. And you had like your outer layer, which was like a Gore-Tex cover, that repelled rain and wind. So that was your sleeping bag. And then we also had jackets. The same thing, we had Gore-Tex jackets to protect us from the rain and the wind and help with the cold. And they issued you, base layers that were thermal layers to help with the cold. Gloves. We got a couple issues of boots. Stuff like that. Helmet for sure. When I first started, they were the old flak jackets that were just protecting against shrapnel. But obviously after 9/11 happened, they started changing some of the equipment that we had, and we started receiving body armor later on.
You said you get multiple boots. Did you ever run out of them? Were you able to get new ones?
Yeah, in the reserves a little bit different. If you run out of them, you got to put requests in. You can get some new ones. Sometimes you just had to buy them on your own. But if you got them, if supply had them, you could get them.
How did you get paid? Did you get paid each week?
So the reserve's a little bit different. We got paid monthly. So it was just direct deposit. So once a month I would receive a direct deposit of my pay.
Were you able to spend the money off base, or did you send it home?
So, when I was active duty for my training time, I really didn't spend a whole lot of money. It just kind of accumulated. And then when I got to my job schools, I had a little bit more freedom where I could, when I had liberties, I can go out and, buy food or, play games and stuff like that. But while I was at boot camp, I really didn't spend a whole lot.
So was the money you got paid enough to live on?
Well, in the reserves, it was more like a part-time job. So, it wasn't my main source of income at that point. When obviously you got paid a little bit more when you're on your 2 weeks that you went away for your summer training. So it was a lot more pay, but it was sufficient for what I was doing.
What were your experiences at the end of your military service?
So at the end of my military service, obviously, when you move up in rank, you get more responsibilities. So when I got promoted to sergeant, I was given a lot more responsibility in my unit. I started getting, for the longest time, I was the only Fort observer for a while. And then when I got promoted to sergeant, there was finally some people underneath me, some Marines that just graduated, came to my unit, and were also Fort observers. So I was in charge of personnel. They had me in charge of the armory, which anytime we had drill on the weekends, any type of serialized gear, whether it was weapons or night vision or anything that had to be issued out, I was responsible for. So in the beginning, I would issue it out, we mark it down at the end. Nobody went home unless everything was accounted for. And I was also in charge of all of the gas masks and stuff like that. So anything that was issued out during training was my responsibility. And at the end of it, it was more, then I had to go to staff meetings. So it was more than just one weekend a month for me. At the end of it, I was going to staff meetings because I was my section leader.
Do you have any personal reflections you would like to add?
As far as what?
Like your experience in the military?
It's a great experience. I don't regret any second of it. If I could do it all over again, I would. It changed me for the better. How I carry myself today. I credit my mom with pretty much who I am, but the military did play a huge role in that too. It gave me, before I went in, I didn't like doing public speaking. It gave me, it's the self-confidence and the leadership skills that I still use today. So I wouldn't change anything.
Did you receive any medals?
I did. I received 3 medals. I received the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal. I got the Selective Marine Corps Reserve Medal. It's kind of like a good conduct medal. You know, you serve so many years with no discipline, you get it. And then the National Defense Medal.
Did you marry after the war?
Yes, so I met my wife in 2005, so I was already discharged when out of the Marines when I met her.
And did you have any children or grandchildren?
Well, no grandchildren yet. I have 2 young little girls. My oldest is 6, her name is Ashley, and my youngest is 5, and her name is Emma.
Do you have any friends when you were serving? Did you keep in contact with any veterans who served while you did?
I do. Facebook helps out with that. You know, some have moved to different areas and moved out, but some are police officers in the area, and I still do keep in contact with them. They kind of make a Facebook page from our old unit, so we're able to kind of keep in contact with each other using that. But you know, for the most part, that's the extent of how we kind of keep in touch.
Do you have any photos or objects still as memories?
I do. So anytime I went either on my monthly trainings or especially when we went away for 2 weeks in the summertime, I usually brought like a camera with me and took some photos and and stuff like that. When I went to I want to say 2003 or 2, I think 2002, they sent me to a sergeant's course, and that's when I learned the leadership skills necessary to be a sergeant and running people underneath me, running drill, marching around, and we were able to, obviously that's where I got my NCO sword, my Marine sword, and that's on display. I have that. Obviously I still have all of my uniforms, even though my wife wants me to get rid of them. Hard-earned, so I do still have some of them with me.
Are you a member of any veterans organization? And so, which one?
I am not currently a member of any.
What message would you like to leave for future generations who will view this interview?
It's a good question. To anybody viewing it, obviously in the future, have deep pride and appreciation for what we have in this country. Respect your flag, respect your country, respect your neighbors. But if you have a chance, enlisting in the military is one of the best experiences and gratifying things that you can do to serve your country.
We'd like to thank you for your service and thank you for coming today and sharing your story with us and the many people that will see in the future.
Thanks for having me.